From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, Donald Trump's revealed a timeline on when he'll make a decision over whether or not to attack Iran. A statement's been read by his press secretary, Caroline Levitt.
Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks.
Well, let's get more on this from LBC's US correspondent Nick Harper, who's in Washington.
I think this is really all about deal-making, once again, hanging that threat over the heads of an adversary, in this case it's Iran, and trying to push them to the negotiating table. Now, that doesn't seem as if it's going to happen anytime soon, and even during the course of this week, Donald Trump himself has said that he's not in the mood for negotiations, and therefore the thinking was that strikes by the US on Iran were imminent. But now he seems to be pulling back.
There's been rocket fire again today between Tehran and Israel over Iran's nuclear capabilities. Nuclear facilities have been targeted in Iran, while it said around 40 people were injured when a hospital in Israel was hit. A Chinese PhD student's been jailed for at least 24 years for drugging and raping 10 women over a 4-year period. 28-year-old Zhen Haozhou has been called one of the UK's most prolific predators. In a victim impact statement, one woman told the court she's lost faith in human beings and gets flashbacks when she meets strangers. Sarah Pikes from the Crown Prosecution Service.
The prosecution team worked with the police for over a year to pick apart the unprecedented amount of footage and web chats showing his meticulous planning and the horrific execution of his crimes.
A woman's been arrested on suspicion of murder after a 69-year-old film director was found stabbed to death in North London. The body of Jennifer Abbott was found by police at her home in Camden last Friday. Her death is being linked by officers to a missing Rolex watch. The Bank of England's decided to keep UK interest rates at 4.25%, but it wasn't a unanimous decision, with 3 of the 9 people involved preferring a cut. And today's been the hottest day of the year so far. Temperatures reached more than 32 degrees Celsius in Kew in West London. An amber heat health alert's been issued across England. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed down 52 points at 87.91. The pound buys $1.34 and €1.17. LBC weather: showers in the southwest tonight, but most places remaining dry, mild and muggy, and a low of 10 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Simon Marks.
I am in for Ian Dale all this week and next week. It is always a pleasure to be with you. And this hour, we are going to have a warts and all conversation about policing. I have spent the last few days devouring the autobiography of my guest here in the studio for the next hour. He's written an absolutely compelling book about his 30 years in the Met, his rise from being a police cadet to beat cop, eventually to detective, chief superintendent, and then onto the role of assistant commissioner. He also took on other tasks, including becoming the UK's head of anti-terrorism policing, and he did it all in spite of, or perhaps because of, the fact that he was a very early person of colour entering the force. His book reveals that he's still not entirely sure how that equation balanced out. He loves the police. He has a tremendous sense of shame over some of his own conduct. He believes the Met has failed and failed again, even to acknowledge the institutional racism that lies within it, much less to do anything about it. And he is very open about the personal demons that he battled as he saw things at murder scenes, terrorism scenes, and crime scenes that no human being should ever have to witness, much less remember. Neil Basu is with me for the full hour. You can listen on the radio, but you can also watch this on the LBC app, and he is happy to take your questions about policing, the good, the bad and the ugly. You can call us at 0345 6060 973, same number for WhatsApp. You can text us at 84850. You can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Neil Basu, welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Sam.
This is a revelatory book in many ways, and it is at times excruciatingly honest. Why did you write it?
I only have one sort of default setting, which is excruciatingly honest, which I think you'd probably want from a police officer, wouldn't you? I wrote it for a number of reasons, probably three very specific reasons. And the first is, and you've highlighted it really, I mean, I think policing's failure to acknowledge institutional racism, apologise for it, admit that it's still there, despite, over 30 years since the William Macpherson, or almost 30 years since William Macpherson made his report, and what that actually means for policing and how much more effective policing could be if it understood that issue. And it's not just about institutional racism. I talk about that because I'm mixed race, so I know a lot about racism. But it's actually it's a wider subject about prejudice. The second reason is, an opportunity for people to understand what happens to people behind the badge. We're human beings, the kind of things we deal with. I like to say we're ordinary people given extraordinary powers to do extraordinary things, but we are ordinary people with the same hopes, fears and families as everyone else. And the last thing is what it does to our families, because we're routinely putting strangers' families before our own, and the toll that it takes on us mentally and physically is not something you realise until you stop, which unfortunately happened to me 2.5 years ago.
You identify as half Indian. Your dad was Indian, and half white Welsh. Your mother was from Wales.
I'm born in England with an English stamp on me.
And as I was saying in the introduction, you've never quite worked out the answer, and it still seems from the book that it troubles you as to whether your rise through the force and your rise ultimately to the post of Assistant Commissioner was in any sense, the pathway was greased as a result of a desire to promote an officer of colour, whereas it is absolutely clear to anybody who reads the book and anybody who follows your career that it may not have been a factor at all, and it may have been simply your talent, skill and ability. How much does that issue trouble you even now?
Well, I'm 57, so I grew up in a very different era to the people who are growing up today. But I've mentored hundreds of officers and people from all walks of life, from all creeds, colours, sexualities, religions and backgrounds. And no one ever wants their protected characteristic to be the reason they're given anything. They want their character and their credibility and their competence, and they want to get their job on merit. And I think everyone who has a protected characteristic sometimes worries that effectively they are either being overlooked because of that characteristic, or they are being overly promoted because of it, neither of which are good. It has to be on merit, but unfortunately we don't live in a sort of post-racial, post-gender society. People are overlooked for their protected characteristics, and I was very fortunate in my career because I talk about the 28 allies who helped me, and they only have they have three things in common. They're all white. 22 of them were men, 6 of them, shamefully, only 6 were women. But they all had power over me at some point in time, and they all gave me help when I needed it. Now I will never know whether they gave me help because it looked good to be helping somebody of colour at that point in the Metropolitan Police's history. I mean, I was 7 years in when Macpherson happened, but I was a young detective sergeant, so... and I like to think I had some capability, and I think I left with a pretty good reputation as a detective. But at the end of the day, it might have been, that they wanted to be seen to be promoting someone of colour. I don't know. But I do know who those people are, and I do know that in the end, they recognised somebody who could do the job, and that's the most important thing.
You write in this book, I didn't want to be an activist, just a great cop. I sound angry, but this book is really my love letter to policing. And you say, I wanted to serve in a fair and diverse force, yet I never did. That's an extraordinary indictment, isn't it, after a 30-year career over the failure of the Met to confront what you absolutely call out in this book time and time again as institutional racism.
Well, even as I was writing it, Dame Louise Casey was writing a damning report on it. So it's not like she didn't have 7,000 interviews who said the same thing. So I think it's very difficult when the data says, a bit similar to William Macpherson's data, we don't recruit, retain or promote people of colour. When we do, we're effectively too hard on them when they make a mistake, or they inevitably end up in front of professional standards, or they leave. We're still making those same mistakes today internally with our own staff, and we're still making the mistakes of over-policing and under-protecting communities of colour. But of course, post-Casey, it was very obvious, and post-Sarah Everard and the monster that was David Kerrick, our confidence amongst women and girls fell through the floor as well. And you could probably argue that we'd never had the confidence of the LGBTQ plus community or the neurodiverse community or the physically disabled community. And eventually, when you start adding up all of those communities, it becomes the majority of the UK public. That's a fairly dangerous position for a police organisation that relies on the consent of the public to do its job.
Can I ask you about the current commissioner, Mark Rowley? In the early stage of the book, you describe him as the epitome of white privilege. And you are critical of him for failing to take on board the concept that institutional racism could be lurking within the Met. How critical are you of him today?
Well, I still wanted Mark to do that. So that's the prologue of the book. So it opens in St Martin in the Fields in the church for Stephen Lawrence's memorial, 30-year memorial. And I was thinking, with probably 500 black people in that church, all applauding and cheering the mayor and Imran Khan, Doreen Lawrence's lawyer, talking about institutional racism still in the Met and needing to be taken out. I thought it might change Mark's mind. I mean, Mark is a close friend, and he was my mentor and my boss. He's largely responsible for me getting the job as head of counter-terrorism, as his deputy during the awful years of 2017. And he hired me to be in counter-terrorism in 2015. I love the man. But what I'm describing is not just Mark. Mark holds the most important position in policing. And therefore, if he doesn't say it, doesn't matter if anybody else does. And it's the Metropolitan Police, the most diverse police force in probably the most diverse city in the world. So it makes a difference if he says it. Now, he went further than most by using the term systemic, but I criticise that for sort of dancing on the head of a pin. It means something to the black community to use the words William McPherson used, and having the empathy to understand why that means something. They didn't trust anybody at the time. They didn't trust William McPherson, but when he delivered that report, they trusted him in the words. And we took it on board back in 1999. The fact that we can't take it on board in 2025, I think, is an abrogation of leadership. I think I know why leaders are doing that. In Mark's case, there is no way the Home Secretary would have given him the job. And certainly I was never in consideration with that Conservative administration for that job because of my views on diversity, inclusion and equality of opportunity.
Well, and it was made clear to you that when you were in the last two in the race to lead the National Crime Agency, you relate that the Home Secretary at the time, Priti Patel, basically intimated that were you to get that job, you would not be tolerated if you spoke out about the issue of institutional racism.
Somebody must teach me something about interview technique, because she didn't intimate it, she just said it very forcefully. So at the end of the interview, when she says, is there anything else you'd like to ask me? And bear in mind, I'd been briefing Priti every week for 2.5 years on counter-terrorism, so she knew me very well. But I said, you'll know what's written, the things I have said publicly about diversity. People still come to me and ask me to talk about diversity. Would I be able to do that in this job? And she looked me in the eye and said, you will only talk about the National Crime Agency if you get this job. And it was very, very clear. I mean, I laughed and sort of said to my wife and friends, I've been gagged before I've even got the job. So, it was very clear to me that I would not be allowed to speak.
Let's go to the phone lines. Mohammed has called from Ealing. Good evening, Mohammed. What's your question for Neil Basu?
Hi, good evening, Jant, and good evening, Neil.
Hi, Mohammed.
I hope you're doing really, really well. As someone who's been on both fences of the law, both a victim and both someone who's been convicted of a crime previously, I'm someone who's been affected by the Metropolitan Police Service ethnically. Why is it that the Metropolitan Police Service cannot reform itself when so many reports after reports have highlighted that institutional racism is in the core of the issues and the reform that needs to be done within the Metropolitan Police Service?
I mean, it's an excellent question, Mohammed, because I don't know if you've read Neil's book, but as you read it and you go through it, time and time again, it is jaw-dropping that these reports get published. You actually wrote one that basically got buried, and 30 years on, you get to the end of your career in the Metropolitan Police and they haven't confronted it any more than they did at the beginning.
Yeah, Mohammed, thanks for that question. I mean, it is fundamentally the most important question policing has to face. And as I said, if you widen it you and I will understand about racism, but if you widen it out to prejudice, I think there's a bigger problem in policing. I see the prejudice, the racism, sexism, homophobia, these are characteristics of bullies. The real disease for me is bullying. And if you look at policing as a profession, it does tend to attract bullies. Let's be honest, it's an authoritarian profession with extraordinary powers over your fellow human beings. You've experienced some of that, Mohammed, and I'm sorry, it doesn't sound like it was the right experience. But also, you create them. You create them by the brutality of the job, and you see people being desensitized and traumatized and going further and further downhill, getting more and more cynical, getting more and more institutionalized, and that comes out in bad behavior, which is bad for the public. Now, can I just say one thing? This is a love letter to policing. It may sound like a love letter from an angry lover, but I've led people since I was 11 years old. Almost every team I've ever worked on, about 20% of the team needed some form of a kick up the backside. So I describe them as either lazy, incompetent, corrupt, or prejudiced. Sometimes they're all four, but leaders can motivate lazy people. They can retrain incompetent people. They should be firing corrupt and prejudiced people. The leadership of policing has failed to do that. And there are far less bad police officers than, you'll forgive me for this, Simon, the media would sometimes have us believe. But there are far more than chief constables who tend to have rather rose-tinted spectacles. I think they think that everyone joined alongside them has the same values or wants to do the same job for the right reasons. That isn't true. And one of my earliest experiences was anti-corruption and professional standards. Every young detective, every young police officer should mandatorily do a stint in professional standards so they will understand what that small core of police officers who ruin it for everyone, including the public, can cause. And therefore that might start to change the culture, Mohammed. But we don't do that, and we should do that. It was a formative lesson for me.
Mohammed, thanks very much for the call. You can ask Neil Basu any questions you have about policing, about counter-terrorism operations. The phone number, of course, is 0345 6060 973. You can text your questions to 84850. You can even ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC, and we'll get your question that way. Neil Basu's book is called Turmoil, 30 Years of Policing, Politics and Prejudice. There is lots more to dig into this book. It's published by Aurum, and we will continue our conversation in just a moment. The time here on LBC is 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Simon Marks on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
And if you call that number, you can put questions this hour to Neil Basu, 30 years at the Metropolitan Police. A former assistant commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, he rose to lead the UK's anti-terrorism policing operations. He's with me for the full hour talking about his autobiography, Turmoil, 30 Years of Policing, Politics and Prejudice. And Neil Basu, I wanted to ask you, given the news of the day, which tonight is certainly dominated by President Trump's decision, it seems, to delay any planned escalation of military attacks on Iran for at least the next 2 weeks. We know that the Prime Minister has been holding Cobra meetings as soon as he got back from the G7 in Canada, and we know that there was concern being expressed at those Cobra meetings about the possibility of terror taking place on the streets of Britain that would be tied to Iran. I've never been in one of those meetings. You've led the counter-terrorism policing unit of the British government. I mean, what kind of a conversation do you think is taking place behind the scenes, especially at this very delicate moment?
Well, a tense one. I've been in dozens of those meetings, and they are, and I, with Keir Starmer's attention to detail and his legal background, there will be some very detailed conversations about what strategies can possibly play out because of this. But fundamentally, at the heart of it all is the fact that when there is a geopolitical event of such huge significance and such huge potential catastrophe, there's always an effect in a country which is incredibly diverse, has many communities living side by side, and is seen as one of the most powerful elements of the West. And of course, those horrific radicalizers and terrorists, from Al-Qaeda through ISIS to Iran's proxies in Hamas and Hezbollah, have spent years developing the narrative that the Muslim community is at war with the West, which is a false narrative that we have struggled to compete against. And that will be what will continue and the UK will be, if they get involved, will be seen as part of that attack against that diaspora.
One of our listeners, John, has texted in from Newton Llewellows to ask how concerned we should be about the fallout of terrorism in the wake of any actions that are taking place in the Persian Gulf. Beyond concern, what will actually, in practical terms, be taking place behind the scenes as events in the Persian Gulf advance?
Well, I'm proud to say I was part of a national security community that I think is one of the best in the world. So all elements, so both the security service, the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, who work overseas with their counterparts in the US, the whole Five Eyes community, which is the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United Kingdom, working together to share intelligence on anything that might be happening anywhere in the world that would affect any one of us. All of that will be going on at great speed with analysts who are often young and overwhelmed by information and working very, very hard. Will be looking at all of that information, trying to piece it together and see what that actually means strategically for the kind of decisions we'd be expecting our Prime Minister and his cabinet to make. Now, practically speaking, that does mean that the heads of those agencies will be looking at the resources they've got and be deciding what are the key priorities for them at this moment, because it's not like all of the other threats that they were dealing with suddenly stopped to deal with this one. So the Prime Minister will be advised by his National Security Advisor, who in turn will be advised by the Joint Intelligence Committee that are taking all of that intelligence from all of the agencies and trying to make some realistic assumptions about what the probability of X happening or what is the possibility of Y happening. I think we live in a world where, particularly with this president, where you'd have to have some crystal ball to understand what was going to happen tomorrow. So I think those meetings will be very, they will be strategizing, but they will be strategizing in the dark at the moment. I mean, it all rests, and you know very well, given where your normal domicile is, you know very well what we're all waiting for. We're all waiting for the most powerful man in the world to make a decision.
Yeah, precisely. Can I ask you about another issue that's been in the news lately, and that is this suggestion that the public deserves to know more about the ethnicity or the colour of suspects. And it's come up in a couple of different cases. I mean, first of all, with regard to the car ramming incident in Liverpool on the day of the Premier League victory celebration, where the police actually broke precedent and came out and said that the suspect was white, and that led to a debate about why they had done it and whether they were actually creating a new precedent. And now, of course, there is this conversation about the ethnicity of grooming gangs and the fact that data has not been collected over the past 15, 20 years on the ethnicity of grooming gangs, and the government says it needs to start getting that data together. Where do you stand on this general issue of whether the public has a right to know the ethnicity or colour of suspects versus the risk that you would be creating as a police force of putting that information into the public domain, even at a time when you have to be really careful about not doing anything that's going to create grounds for appeal or claims of prejudice at trial?
Well, I think this horse has bolted. So, I mean, I think policing is stuck now with a 24/7 global culture of information overload, which they can't compete with. So there's only one way to compete with that, and that's to get the absolute truth out there as quickly as humanly possible. So I think transparency is the most important thing, and I think we can get into all kinds of political debate about the use of language and what people think and what people are going to do with that information. And policing is always, I've been in many meetings where you're sitting there, you're thinking about the ramifications of what you say. Your prime job is to keep the peace. Before preventing and detecting crime, your prime job is to keep the peace. If you think something is going to cause disorder, then you are going to think twice about doing that. You're going to put some serious thought into that. Some of that will have underpinned everything from 20 years ago with the grooming gang scandal and not wanting to create community tension and disorder. But in the end, it's all an abrogation of leadership. I mean, at the end of the day, if you don't have the data, we live in a very modern world where everyone uses data to make decisions. We call ourselves, I still say we, I can't get out. That will always be the case, blue through and through. But you cannot make decisions without good data. If you're not recording the data, if you're not looking at the data, how can you make the decisions about what you say publicly or not? And the idea that the public would look at the police, and probably we've had 40 years of collapsing confidence in authority of all kinds. You know, whether it's your local doctor, whether it's your local police officer, or whether it's your local politician, the press have suffered the same sort of collapse in do we trust them or not. If you understand that's happening, you've got to be open and transparent. You know, you don't really have that choice anymore. And I think by recording the data, we can actually start to have some proper conversations about what the problem actually is. And the grooming scandal is that is a much bigger conversation. I was speaking at the Institute for Government earlier on today, and that very subject came up. And I would say one of the worst things about the grooming scandal for a professional detective is just how incompetent the investigations were, regardless of the reason. You know, I was taught to be victim-focused. I was taught to understand and listen to a victim, even if I had to, you know, absolutely try and prove or disprove their account in order to prove the crime. You listen to the victim. We didn't listen to the victims. The incompetence of the investigation, regardless of what drove that, is an embarrassment for policing. Then we need to get on to why those decisions were made, and you can't do that without the data. So Louise Casey was absolutely right to do what she did and to talk about we have to understand the data before we come to any conclusions. So I'm pro-data, I'm pro-collection, and I'm pro-advertising it to the public. We serve the public, not the other way around. And you say they have a right to know? I think they do.
But also just accepting we live in a crazy 24-hour cycle of social media, and you've got to get out in front of that train by providing information in real time to the public, that there's no way you can put that genie back in the bottle?
You can see the expression on my face. I'm not pro that, but I've tried to put that genie back in the bottle along with my counterparts in the Five Eyes community. And when the head of counter-terrorism in the UK and the head of counter-terrorism in the FBI and for Canada, Australia and New Zealand write to 6 major social media companies and say, will you meet us and discuss the problems that are being caused by your service, and they tell you no, you know you've got a problem.
Absolutely shameful, isn't it?
They met the attorney generals because they knew that meant the law was going to change. You know, at the end of the day, they're interested in the bottom line. The most powerful thing that can happen is where the public decide enough is enough. You know, police officers, law enforcement, intelligence agencies can talk about changing it, but society has to say, this is too much. We have to do something about putting that genie back. So I'm not pro that at all. But at the moment, policing has to respond to what's in front of it. And it has to get better at this. It has to get digitally better, and it has to get quicker. But it starts with telling the truth and getting that truth out into as many places. We all know which radio shows, which TV shows, which print and which social media platforms get the most views. You've got to be on them with your strapline, giving your story, giving the truth as quickly as possible, with a really credible spokesperson standing out the front, being prepared to take difficult questions from you.
Much more to come, more questions from me, but also from you. For Neil Basu, 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. At exactly 8:30, the news headlines come from Daryl Jackson.
Donald Trump says he'll make a decision on whether or not to attack Iran within 2 weeks. The US president's press secretary says he's unafraid to use strength if necessary, but wants to pursue diplomacy. A Chinese PhD student's been jailed for at least 24 years for drugging and raping 10 women over a 4-year period. 28-year-old Zhen Haozhou has been called one of the UK's most prolific predators. And the interest rate's been held at 4.25%, though not all on the Bank of England's committee were agreed, signalling a potential cut in August. LBC weather: showers in the southwest tonight, but most places remaining dry, mild and muggy with a low of 10 degrees.
This is LBC. Simon Marks on LBC. Text 84850.
Talking this hour to Neil Basu, a 30-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, also the UK's former head of counter-terrorism policing. His autobiography is called Turmoil, 30 Years of Policing, Politics and Prejudice, and I can tell you it is a very good read. Let's go to the phone lines. Alishba is on the phone from Richmond. Good evening, Alishba. What would you like to ask Neil Basu?
Good evening. How are you?
Very well, thanks. We're good.
Good. Grand. Hi, Neil.
Hi, Alicia.
I'm joining as a special constable in around 3 to 4 weeks' time.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I was just wondering if you had any advice for me or any tips.
Well, I'm not sure Simon's going to give me enough time to go through what you need to know. The most
He's
important
gearing up
thing,
for Hendon.
So if I had to say very quickly what the most important things were is remember why you joined in the first place. So it is all about the public and putting the public first. And what the public really want from its cops is, honesty, bravery, all of that is absolutely taken for granted. But what they really want is a bit of compassion. So when I speak to cops, I want them to be quick to respond. I want them to be competent when they get there, so know the law, know your job, pay attention to your study and learning, and be compassionate with the victims when you get there. That's what it's all about.
Thank you so much.
Alishba, can I ask you why you've decided to join the force?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you, Simon. I work in a hospital, so kind of frontline anyway, but I've always ended up in situations where I might have come across a member of the public who might be in turmoil, and there are police officers on the scene, on duty. And I've always wanted the power and the skills to be able to actually do something about it. And hopefully this will be a stepping stone for that, where I can help people.
Good for you, Elishma. And I'm also I'm the son of a doctor and a nurse and the brother of a doctor. So the commonality between medics who want to put public service first, there is... my dad used to tell me that Gandhi used to say there is no higher calling than to lose yourself in the service of others. You've already done it in one profession. Thank you for doing it in mine.
Thank you so much. That's so sweet.
Cheers, Elishma. Good luck. Thanks for calling in. We've had a text from a listener who does not want, for reasons that will become obvious, their name to be read out. But they say, to Neil Basu, with respect, I am an officer on a response team in Haringey. We are a diverse team policing a majority non-white British community. There is no racism here, and if there was, I'd report it, and I'm confident it would be dealt with. Yet the media will tell you that Haringey is full of racist cops. Senior officers, this officer says, such as yourself, are saying the same. However, in my 10 years, a member of management board has never actually joined us on the street, yet they speak for the force and tell us we need to change our culture, but don't know the culture on the front line, which is hard-working cops doing their best. What's your response to that?
I think it's a really good challenge. So particularly the thing about management board not joining us on the street. I'm not sure that was true of Cress when she was commissioner. She spent an awful lot of time out on the street with response teams and neighbourhood teams. Too much, I thought, sometimes. We could have used her back making some decisions at New Scotland Yard, but she was very fond of doing that. And I think that is incredibly important. The one thing I've always thought about policing is, I did start as a police constable and as a detective constable on the street, working on the streets. Most chief constables still have that as their backstory. I've never understood how we forget how hard the streets are and how we lose respect for how difficult that job is as we get more senior and away from that. We shouldn't. We should get back out there. In terms of the racism thing, I don't disagree with you. It's a very nuanced conversation about institutional racism. It is not about frontline officers being racist. And let's be honest, there are a few that are, and they need to be tackled and got out of the service. And your professional standards unit will tell you there's plenty of evidence of that in WhatsApp groups between people, very much hidden from view and not obvious. And when I joined, it wasn't obvious either. People don't, generally speaking, say it to your face anymore. They're not that stupid. But the number of people who are like that is very small. Institutional racism is about policies and procedures that end up giving disproportionate results, and that is a question of leaders, not frontline officers. Frontline officers shouldn't feel tainted by that at all. And in terms of not seeing that kind of racism in the front line, I'm incredibly pleased to hear that. But it also doesn't surprise me because policing isn't like policing when I joined, and I would never have joined in the 70s and 80s. But in the 90s, it was much worse. I could guarantee you that 100% of black, Asian and female officers I met would have had a horror story about how they had been treated by at least one member of the service. Louise Casey didn't find that. She found it was more like 50% and more like 30% for women. So that, I would say that's not fast enough progress, but it is remarkably different from the force I joined. And I'm an optimist on this subject. It's getting better. If your relief is like that, in Haringey, my relief when I was a young detective, police sergeant and detective sergeant in Lambeth was just like the one you described. And I worked Brixton and Streatham. So you've given me hope and optimism.
Bit of optimism for you tonight. Let's go to Twickenham. Paul is there this evening. Good evening, Paul.
Good evening, Simon. Good evening, Neil.
Hi, Paul.
Neil, my question to you is whether you share my unease about the history of hard stops of cars alleged to be carrying dangerous gunmen. My proposition to you, Neil, and I'd be very interested whether you share it, is whether it would not be safer for everybody, the police and the occupants of the vehicle, where practical, unless the person's actually shooting out of the window at passers-by, to follow the vehicle discreetly, see where it goes to, then organise a containment of that property and a more slow, steady and measured approach to dealing with that suspect. They're not guilty, they're a suspect. And a follow-up on that, Neil, which the producer didn't want me to ask, is if you do insist on continuing with hard stops on cars when you can hardly see who's inside, particularly at night. What about the use of non-lethal ammunition, baton rounds? Those are my questions, and apologies to your producer who said I was only allowed one question.
I think he'll get over it, Paul. Neil.
I was head of armed policing once, so I have a lot of views on this particular subject. It's your comment about wouldn't it be safer and hard stops, Paul. Hard stops are a very, very confrontational and...
Can we just explain what a hard stop is?
A hard stop is if somebody is armed in a vehicle, it's bringing the vehicle to a stop using tactical contact from other vehicles which contain 3 very heavily armed police officers. And if the vehicle doesn't stop... and we've seen one recently where there was a catastrophic car accident because of it, and we've seen one where there was a shooting. And we know that famous case. So they are very, very difficult confrontational, and it is a very difficult tactical decision to make. They're not unbelievably common. So the couple of things I'd say for the reassurance of other listeners, Paul, I strongly suspect you know quite a lot about this subject, but there's only around 12% of police officers in the UK who are trained to carry weapons, so we should feel good as citizens that we put a lot of effort into the training and professionalism of police officers. There are thousands of armed operations carried out every year, and probably between 5 and 10 times shots are fired. That's an unbelievable statistic. And I talk about the fact that back when I was dealing with the Duggan and Rodney inquests, the media were calling armed police officers cowboys and killers. They couldn't be further from the truth. But the tactic you've picked on is probably the most dangerous tactic for both the suspect and for the officers involved. And sometimes the intelligence is they aren't going to go somewhere and put their heads down for the night or get rid of the gun. They're on their way to either kill somebody or commit an armed robbery. So the important thing for police officers is that they cannot allow a gun, particularly a gun with somebody who is willful and intending to use it to kill or to threaten or to potentially commit a major crime, to be left to carry on to their final destination, because there may not be the opportunity to negotiate them out of that. But I agree with you and actually most of the high-end counter-terrorism security, counter-terrorism specialist firearms officers and ARV officers that you see in uniform would agree with you that the best thing to do is to contain to negotiate somebody safely out of a premises. That's where we prefer to do the work, in the early hours of the morning, preferably when the person is not very alert and when it's safest to do so. So your question is correct, but it's not always possible. So there has to be a tactical consideration. I dealt with this with the head of armed policing when I was head of lethal weapons. So your comment about using less lethal is not a 100% guarantee that you're going to be able to subdue somebody. And if you don't have that 100% guarantee and they have high caliber weapons and ammunition, you are basically asking police officers to put their lives even more on the line than you're asking them to do now. I'm afraid it's a bit of a cliche, but you don't take a knife to a gunfight.
Can I ask you about the Chris Cabba case, and particularly the decision to put Sergeant Martin Blake in front of a misconduct probe, and slightly more broadly about whether armed officers should be allowed to preserve their anonymity when inquiries like this take place? What's your reaction to the misconduct probe?
It's difficult to talk about because Martin is facing a misconduct probe. So if I talk about it in the round, because what's happening to him is the standard thing that happens. You fire your weapon, you get investigated for firing your weapon. If that could potentially lead to an IOPC inquiry or a professional standards inquiry, could lead to misconduct. If you fired your weapon and injured or killed somebody, that could lead to an inquest. Even if you've been cleared by the professional standards inquiry, the inquest could then lead to different evidence in a criminal trial. Once the inquest and criminal trial have taken place, again, you can lead to another misconduct. I think you're getting my point here, that cannot be justice for anybody, including the bereaved family. I mean, you're ending up with... I also was the boss of Tony Long, who shot Azelle Rodney, and Tony went on to write his own autobiography, which is a very powerful book by an armed police officer. Whatever you think about Tony and what he did or did not do, it was 9 years of his life facing these interminable inquiries. And also for Azelle Rodney's family, it was 9 years of their life not knowing what was going to happen. We've got to do something about that. that system cannot be right. So regardless of this current case, that system is wrong. In terms of anonymity, there is a basic principle of English jurisprudence and law that has existed through common law for a very long time, that you should know the name, you should know the name of the person who's been charged. And there are certain circumstances in which that might not happen if that leads to, an imminent threat to that person's life. What happened in the Chris Cabba case is the minute Martin Blake's identity was revealed, the threat to life that the judge couldn't give him anonymity on happened. So my point on that is, and I respect the judge very much, I know the judge in question well, and I respect him hugely. He's a very fine judge. And I respect the British criminal justice process well. But, I was an expert at dealing in gangland and organised crime as well as counter-terrorism. It was not hard to foresee that by naming that officer with the emotions of that case, he would then face life-threatening consequences for him and his family. I think we have to accept that that's what happens these days, and that's partly a consequence of not having the confidence of, vast sections of the black community because of our history. And this goes to my point about not understanding institutional racism. If we are going to take the life or somebody loses their life in police hands, you want the benefit of the doubt and the investigation to take place. You don't want a riot. You don't want threats to the life of the officers involved. You want the community to give you the benefit of the doubt. We are a long way off that community giving us the benefit of the doubt. We've got to get better at that. Sorry to expand the answer.
No, not at all. Glad you did. More of your questions for Neil Basu to come. We've got some breaking news that we need to bring you from the world of politics. The Labour Member of Parliament for Lewisham North, Vicky Foxcroft, has just resigned as a government whip because of the government's proposed welfare reforms. In a letter to Sir Keir Starmer, she says she cannot vote for reforms which include cuts to disabled people's finances. And when Labour was in opposition, she served as the Shadow Minister for Disabled People. So a casualty for Sir Keir Starmer's government as a result of the welfare reform proposals that were unveiled just yesterday. The Labour Member of Parliament for Lewisham North, Vicky Foxcroft, resigning as a government whip over them, and I'm sure we'll be bringing you more coverage of that as the evening continues here on LBC, where the time is now 14 minutes to 9.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
Conflict in the Middle East, Israel and Iran, the possible involvement of the United States. Let's bring into the conversation Conservative MP and Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel. If the United States was to ask for permission to use Diego Garcia to launch these bunker busters, what should the British government's response be, yes or no?
I categorically think the government has to act. They'll make that decision based on intelligence and...
What do you think it should be?
I think the answer should be yes, absolutely. Let's be very clear. Iran, a country that sponsors and bankrolls terrorism and is directly responsible for much of the bloodshed and the conflict in the Middle East.
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio, on Global Player and the new LBC app. Leading Britain's conversation with Simon Marks. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
And tonight, in this hour of the programme, I am with Neil Basu, the veteran of the Metropolitan Police, 30 years with the Met. He was Assistant Commissioner at New Scotland Yard and rose to the role of the UK's head of counter-terrorism policing, and he's taking your questions about policing. I was going to ask you what you're doing with your time, but I now have discovered what you are about to start doing with some of your time, and you're going to be co-hosting a new podcast for us here at Global called The Crime Agents. We've already got the news agents, of course. We've got the sports agents. Now we're going to have the crime agents that you're going to be co-hosting with LBC's crime correspondent, Andy Hughes. Tell us a bit about what listeners will hear on that podcast when it launches.
Well, the idea is Andy's got 20 years in investigative journalism and undercover journalism as a crime correspondent, and I've got 30 years of catching criminals on the other side of the coin. So I think you'll see some. I get on great with Andy, but I'm hoping he'll test me quite a lot, as good journalists do with police officers. But you'll get to understand a little bit about what goes on behind the scenes, and it's really interesting. I mean, bear in mind the number of politicians and media that I've had to brief on policing in my time. I'm always absolutely amazed by how, this is not supposed to be disrespectful, but how little people know about actually the process and procedure of crime, about what actually happens when a crime happens, what actually happens when people are reporting on it, and what that actually means. And Andy and I both had that discussion. And when the news agents came to us, and it was actually Lewis who said every time we have a crime story on, our ratings go so high, we think the public might be interested in more detail. And I've sat at home, retired for the last 2.5 years, ranting at the television, the radio and the press, saying, you've got that wrong, you don't understand that point. Some of the questions that are coming in tonight are brilliant. You want to be able to have the time to explain that. And instead I get 2 minutes on Radio 4, 10 if you're really lucky and you've got a major story. You just don't get enough time to explain stuff. And that's where podcasts come into their own. And I know everyone's got one, but not everyone's talking about crime.
No, I think it sounds really... When does it launch? When's the first one out?
Well, the first one's out next Wednesday. So
Great.
The first trailer went out yesterday, and I'm hoping people have picked that up. And Andy's got a very exciting launch episode. He's been out doing some of his great investigative journalism to help us launch the episode with some panache, I think.
Panache. Next Wednesday, you will find it on Global Player. It is called The Crime Agents with Neil Basu and LBC's very own Andy Hughes. Let's go back to the phone lines and Peter, who is on the line from Bexley. Good evening, Peter.
Good evening, and good evening, Mr. Basu.
Good evening.
I've heard you speak at some length this evening about the matters that you feel are most important and crucial to the Metropolitan Police. But surely a matter of equal, if not greater importance, is that every single day of the year, victims of crime in London, in the Metropolitan Police area, are failed by the Met because they do not get a prompt, professional kind of investigation that they should do. And consequently, the offenders don't get caught, and we have a criminals charter where on so many of our streets, they rule the roost.
And let me just say to listeners that Peter knows of what he speaks because he's Peter Blexley, a former detective in the Met and a regular contributor to LBC. Neil.
Hi, Peter. I recognised your voice. I'm going to disappoint you, Peter, by completely agreeing with you. So, I mean, something you will have found it as astonishing as I did, but 6 chief constables coming out in public before a spending review talking about not having enough money to do the job was an extraordinary moment in time. You know, I've been involved in plenty of behind-the-scenes tense conversations with the Home Office and with the Treasury about funding for policing, but it's extraordinary to see that in public. So I don't know this for a fact, but I strongly suspect they are feeling very much in trouble about not having the resources to produce the kind of service that you've talked about. And Peter, you will know very well that everybody who runs a major organisation only has a limited amount of resource and has to make some very difficult prioritisation choices. You know, good cops use good data, good intelligence to put their people where crimes are going to happen. But, you know, one of the fundamental things that happened in the last 10 years is because of the lack of resource through 14 years of austerity, we started putting our money where the greatest threat, harm and risk was. Now, of course, the greatest threat, harm and risk aren't the crimes that most routinely members of the public are associated with. They hardly ever meet a police officer, they hardly ever have any call for a police officer, but when they do, they don't tend to be in murder or organised crime or rape. They tend to be in burglary and street theft and antisocial behaviour and graffiti. And unless you have the resources to deal with both, chief constables are going to veer towards serious threat, harm and risk. And that's been a real problem. And unless we can get more resource into policing, I'm not sure how Labour's going to achieve its missions.
And because the man or woman who has their car stolen or the tools stolen from the back of their van or they have their house burgled and they are confronted with really dismissive kind of language from the call handler. Do you know who did it? Have you got any CCTV? That kind of stuff. Because they don't get to see a police officer. Their crime is not properly investigated. This is why the reputation of the Metropolitan Police amongst working people is in the gutter.
Yeah, I don't know the facts and figures behind the call handling issue. I mean, I think Claire Waxman, the Victims Commissioner for London, would probably have agreed with you when I sat on the Mayor's London Policing Board that we weren't doing enough for victims. You and I will both have had long policing careers in which it is entirely possible to give a victim a brilliant service in which they feel really cared for, even though they knew you had no chance of solving their crime. I think we've lost the skill of, giving some empathy, sympathy and compassion to members of the public, even when we know we're not going to be able to solve their most wicked problem. That skill is something that can be taught. I sometimes wonder that we're not recruiting the right people for it.
Peter, thanks very much indeed for asking that question. It's an important issue to surface, and it's one that Neil Basu talks about pretty extensively in his autobiography. Let's go to Cambridge. Hassan is there this evening. Good evening, Hassan. What's your question?
Yeah, good evening. My question is, if you listen to Reform and some right-wing media, there is a perception that there is two-tier policing where white people are at a disadvantage. In your experience, is that valid? Are people of colour treated better than their white counterparts in the criminal justice system?
Key question from Hassan in Cambridge. Neil Basu?
Hassan, I love the way you phrased that question because, if I wasn't laughing, I'd be crying. Of course it's not right. I think everyone who works, and I've lectured in the Crown Prosecution Service on matters of diversity and disproportionality. The Crown Prosecution Service, the rest of the criminal justice system, it has terrible disproportionality issues with colour in the system. And of course the people feeding that hopper are the police. So no, it's not true. And I do get very upset with politicians who use the phrase two-tier. When they use that phrase, they're immediately putting every frontline police officer at risk. And this is the classic problem with policing. You're always the thin blue line. We're too soft for the right and we're too lenient, we're too hard for the left. So you're left trying to police both sections of communities in a way that you think is, without fear or favour is the expression. You're never going to get that right from everyone, but it really doesn't help when politicians use vacuous sound bites like two-tier to describe an incredibly difficult and nuanced problem. But no, it is not true that police officers are necessarily treating members of the black and Asian community better than they're treating members of the white community. There is a much more complicated argument to have about how policing does its job, and issues of race, gender, class, poverty and social mobility all come into it. We have a long history, 200 years nearly, of policing, a certain section of the population, which always brings us into conflict with the poorest members of society, the youngest members of society. There are people we have natural conflict with because of the job we do. But the two-tier comment has become a political soundbite that is really dangerous. It's dangerous for confidence in policing, it's dangerous for the public, and it's really dangerous for our frontline officers.
Hassan, thank you for the call. I want to squeeze one more call in, and it comes from Mel in Norwich. Good evening, Mel. What would you like to ask Neil Basu?
Hi, Neil. Thank you. Really quickly, Neil, how do you cope mentally, and how do you, support your colleagues mentally? Because you come across the most heinous of crimes, and, in order to do a good job, you've got to be strong mentally, and I'm just wondering how you actually cope.
It's a very good question, and you are very honest in this book about the mental health challenges that you and some of your colleagues have faced.
Oh, Mel, I mean, thank you very much for asking that. I sit on the board of a great charity called Police Care UK that deals with physically and mentally injured officers. And over the last 5 years, the number of beneficiaries calls that we've had is 85% from people with mental health conditions suffering from post-traumatic stress and complex post-traumatic stress. Now, I'm very lucky I didn't get to that level of clinical condition, but I've seen things nobody should have to see, and it does have a terrible effect. And we have to do more about looking after. There is a great national wellbeing programme called Oscar Kilo, run by an ex-Chief Constable called Andy Rhodes, who is a ex-Chief Constable of Lancashire, who's a brilliant person who spent his whole career trying to look after young police officers who were being traumatised by the job, and is now trying to do that in his retirement. We need more investment in that. I mean, and it's really important for the public to understand that, you know, the traditional coping mechanisms that police officers use are incredibly destructive. You know, if you're going to drink, you're going to smoke yourself to death. And I have severe asthma from 30 years of chain smoking, thinking that was coping, you know, a stress coping mechanism when it was increasing my stress and ruining my health. But you cannot rely on that and those kind of addictions when you are suffering. You have to get proper help, proper counselling, proper help, from talking therapy to clinical needs if necessary. So thank you for asking the question. It's incredibly important. But the fitter and healthier, both mentally and physically, our police officers are, the better service the public's going to get. So it's a crucial issue.
Mel, thanks for raising it. Archie has texted in to say, your guest has been brilliant. He should still be in the service. We need people like him there.
Oh, thanks, Archie.
And thanks to you, Neil Basu. Neil Basu is the author of an autobiography called Turmoil, 30 Years of Policing, Politics and Prejudice. It is published by Aurum Publishing is the name of the publisher, but just look it up online. Turmoil, 30 Years of Policing, Politics and Prejudice by Neil Basu. It's a great read, and I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation this evening. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you, Simon.
You're listening to LBC. Don't forget that The Crime Agents with Neil Basu and my colleague, LBC's crime correspondent Andy Hughes, will be out next Wednesday. And I will be with you for another hour here on LBC through until 10 o'clock. But now it's time to get to the news.
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Donald Trump will decide within the next 2 weeks whether or not to strike Iran. In a statement relayed by his press secretary, the US president said he still sees a substantial chance that negotiations can achieve US and Israeli demands on Iran's nuclear program. Khan Ross, former head of the Middle East policy for the UK mission to the United Nations, told LBC this is very good news.
A diplomatic solution has always been available. Israel didn't need to start this war. Iranians have agreed a deal in the past to denuclearize or limit its enrichment of nuclear materials, and that a deal is still available. So I'm glad that it appears that Trump has given some space for that possibility.
Well, the Prime Minister has called for de-escalation in the Middle East. A hospital in Israel and a nuclear site in Iran were hit last night. Former Labour Defence Secretary Jeff Hoon told LBC the international fallout of attacking Iran could be bigger than the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
We've seen already that the Russians are indicating on the back of their agreement with Iran, they have a military defence cooperation agreement, that they would be very concerned about any action taken by the United States. It is far-reaching and potentially very serious.
A Chinese PhD student who drugged and raped 10 women in London and China has been jailed for at least 24 years. Detectives think 28-year-old Zen Halzo could have targeted dozens more victims. Met Police Detective Inspector Richard Mackenzie led the investigation.
Zoe is a vile and depraved individual who committed the most cowardly and wicked of crimes. This has been one of the most complex, challenging and heart-rending investigations that we have ever carried out.
The Labour MP Vicky Foxcroft has resigned as a government whip over the party's welfare proposals. She said in a letter to the Prime Minister she could not vote for reforms which include cuts to disabled people's finances. The Bank of England said that interest rates remain on a downward path despite being kept at 4.25%. The Monetary Policy Committee voted 6-3 for the status quo. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 52 points at 87.91. The pound buys $1.34 and €1.17. LBC weather: showers in the southwest tonight, but most places remaining dry, a low of 10 degrees. From Global's newsroom, for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Simon Marks.
And I am in for Ian Dale. I've been in this week. I'll be in again next week. And I thought for our last hour together tonight, we're going to change pace.
Now here,